There's a film that most people have never seen. It runs for approximately 50 minutes. It has no conventional plot, no dialogue in the traditional sense, no score composed for it, no studio logo at the beginning. It was shot in the California desert and on the highways leading out of Los Angeles in the spring of 1969 by a small group of people who were not professional filmmakers and who were working without a budget, without a distribution plan, and without anyone's permission. The man who made it was, at the time, one of the most famous rock musicians in America. He was 25 years old. He had just finished recording one of the most critically discussed albums of the decade. He had a sold-out tour beginning in weeks, and instead of preparing for any of that, Jim Morrison drove into the desert with a camera and made a film that he would show to almost no one, and that would spend years in a box, largely unseen, waiting for a world that might eventually be ready to understand what it was actually about. The film was called HWY, an American Pastoral, and it was, in ways that Jim Morrison could articulate only partially, and the people around him understood even less, the most honest thing he had ever made. But to understand why Jim Morrison made HWY, and what making it cost him, and what it revealed about the distance between the person the world had decided he was and the person he was actually trying to be, you have to go back to a classroom at UCLA in 1964, where a 20-year-old film student sat watching Ingmar Bergman's The Silence and felt, with the particular certainty of someone recognizing something they have always known, that this, not music, not performance, not the rock and roll that was reshaping American culture around him, was the medium he wanted to work in. Jim Morrison arrived at UCLA's film school with the focused intensity of someone who had finally found the right container for what he was carrying. He had been an extraordinary student in every school he had attended, not because he applied himself to the curriculum, but because he read everything adjacent to it, everything underneath it, everything the curriculum pointed toward without quite reaching. He had read more philosophy by the age of 19 than most people encounter in a lifetime. He had absorbed the French symbolists and the beat writers and the romantic poets and Nietzsche and Blake, and Artaud with the appetite of someone who is not building a literary education but searching, urgently and without a clear map, for a language adequate to what he was experiencing inside. Film, when he encountered it seriously at UCLA, felt like that language. It was visual and temporal simultaneously. It could hold silence the way poetry held silence. It could place a human figure in a landscape and, through the relationship between the two, say something that neither the figure nor the landscape could say alone. Jim Morrison understood this immediately, instinctively, in the way he understood most things that mattered to him, not through analysis but through recognition. He made student films, he wrote screenplays that his professors found simultaneously impressive and unclassifiable. He studied the European directors with the same consuming attention he gave to the poets, Bergman and Goddard and Antonioni, filmmakers who treated the camera not as a recording device but as a philosophical instrument, a way of asking questions that could not be asked in words. He was, by multiple accounts, among the most gifted students in the program. He was also, by the same accounts, the least interested in the professional machinery that surrounded the art form, the industry, the studios, the commercial imperatives that shaped what films got made and how they got made and who got to make them. And then, in the summer of 1965, on a pier in Venice Beach, Ray Manzarek heard Jim read from a notebook and said 3 words that redirected everything, set them to music. The music took over, the doors formed, the albums came. The fame arrived with the particular force of something that, once it has found you, reorganizes every other possibility around itself. The film school ambitions did not disappear. Jim Morrison was not the kind of person whose ambitions simply dissolved under pressure, but they were displaced, pushed to the margins of a life that had rapidly become defined by something he had not entirely chosen and could not entirely control. By 1968, The Doors had released 3 albums. Jim Morrison was one of the most photographed, most interviewed, most discussed figures in American rock. He was also, in ways that the photographs and the interviews did not capture, increasingly restless with the distance between the performer the world was consuming and the artist he believed himself to be. The Lizard King persona, which had grown from his own language, his own metaphors, his own genuine artistic instincts, had calcified into a fixed image that the industry required him to maintain and the public required him to deliver. The mask had become load-bearing. Removing it was not a simple matter of decision. The entire structure depended on it. He wrote through all of it. The notebooks accumulated, the poems multiplied. He published The Lords and the New Creatures in 1969, two collections of poetry that were reviewed sparsely and condescendingly, as if the idea of a rock musician writing serious poetry was inherently a category error. The reviews stung not because they were wrong about the poetry, some were not, but because they confirmed what Jim Morrison had been slowly understanding for years, that the image of the Lizard King was now so large and so fixed that nothing he made outside of its frame could be received on its own terms. The film was the answer to that, or the attempt at an answer. In early 1969, Jim Morrison approached Frank Lisciandro, a friend from his UCLA days who had remained a filmmaker, and proposed a project. Not a music film, not a documentary about the Doors, a narrative film or something adjacent to narrative, something that used the grammar of cinema to say things that the grammar of rock music could not say. The concept was spare to the point of severity. A man alone on a highway, hitchhiking through the California desert, moving without a visible destination through a landscape that was simultaneously real and symbolic, American and mythological, present and somehow outside of time. Jim Morrison would play the character. He would also direct. He would do both things at once, which was not how films were conventionally made, but Jim Morrison had never been primarily interested in convention. Frank Lisciandro, along with Paul Ferrara and Babe Hill, formed the crew. They were small in number and large in commitment, people who understood that what Jim was trying to do was something outside the normal categories and who were willing to follow him into the desert on those terms. They drove out to the Mojave in March of 1969, loaded the camera, and began shooting. What Jim Morrison did in front of the camera during the making of HWI was unlike anything he did on a stage. The performances that had made him legendary were characterized by an outward intensity, a quality of pressure and presence that reached toward the audience, that demanded response, that generated the particular electricity of a human being operating at the absolute edge of their capacity for exposure. On the highway in the Mojave Desert, with only a small crew and a camera and the open landscape around him, Jim Morrison did the opposite. He receded. He became quiet in a way that the stage never allowed. He walked. He stood at the side of the road and looked at the horizon. He sat in the passenger seat of a car and watched the desert move past the window with an expression that was not performing anything, not intensity, not mystery, not the Lizard King. Just a person looking at the world going by, thinking thoughts that the camera could sense but not translate. The character he played was never named. He was a hitchhiker, the oldest American archetype of freedom and displacement, the figure who exists in the spaces between destinations, who belongs nowhere and is therefore free to be anywhere. Jim Morrison had written about the highway obsessively throughout his career, in poems and songs that treated the road not as a route between points but as a condition of being, a state of perpetual becoming that was the closest thing he had found to the freedom he was always moving toward and never quite reaching. In HWI, the highway was no longer metaphor, it was the film's entire world. Frank Lisciandro would later describe the shooting days as unlike anything else he had experienced in filmmaking. Jim was completely present on location in a way that he sometimes struggled to be in the conventional spaces of his public life, recording studios, interview rooms, the backstage corridors of arenas. In the desert, he was still. He looked at things for a long time. He would ask Frank to hold on a particular shot, the road stretching into the distance, the heat shimmer above the asphalt, the mountains against the sky, long past the point where most directors would have called cut, because he was interested in what the image became when it was held long enough for the ordinary to tip into something stranger and more truthful. There was one sequence, filmed over the course of a single afternoon on a stretch of highway outside 29 Palms, that Jim returned to repeatedly in conversations about the film in the months after it was completed. He had stood at the roadside for nearly an hour, not doing anything that would conventionally be called acting, simply standing and looking and existing in the frame. The camera held on him from a distance, and the distance was important. It was the distance of observation rather than intimacy, the distance at which a person stops being a character and starts being a fact of the landscape. Jim said afterward that that hour had been the most completely himself he had felt in years, not performing, not maintaining, not delivering what the image required. Simply being a figure in a space, subject to the same light and wind and silence as everything around him. The film was completed in the summer of 1969. Jim Morrison held a small screening for a group of friends and collaborators. The response was not what he had hoped for, not hostile, not dismissive, but uncertain in the way that work is uncertain when it does not fit any available category. People did not know what to do with it. It was not a music film. It was not a conventional narrative. It was not experimental in the way that experimental film was expected to be experimental. It was something quieter and stranger and more personal than any of those things, and the people watching it could feel that something was being communicated but could not quite find the vocabulary for what it was. Jim Morrison did not push for wider distribution. He did not bring it to festivals or studios or any of the mechanisms through which films found audiences. He put the reels in a box. The box went into storage. Doors continued, the tour continued. The machinery of fame continued, grinding forward with its own momentum, indifferent to the 50 minutes of desert footage that sat in a box somewhere in Los Angeles, waiting. Ray Manzarek saw the film privately after Jim had completed it. He would say later that it was the most direct window he had ever been given into the part of Jim Morrison that the music, for all its depth and power, could not quite reach. The highway was not a symbol in HWI, it was a fact. And the figure walking along it, quiet, unhurried, looking at the landscape with the full attention that fame had made nearly impossible in ordinary life, was not the Lizard King. It was Jim. Jim Morrison left for Paris in March of 1971. He took notebooks. He took the manuscript of the poems he had been working on. He did not take the film. Reels which remained in their box in Los Angeles. He died in Paris on July 3, 1971, 27 years old, with HWI still largely unseen and with the reviews of his poetry still condescending and with the image of the Lizard King still the thing the world reached for when it tried to locate him. The film was eventually released, quietly and without significant fanfare, in the years following his death. It found over time the audience that serious and idiosyncratic work eventually finds, not the millions who knew the music, but the particular viewers who came to it because they were looking for the Jim Morrison that the mythology had buried and found him exactly where he had left himself, alone on a highway in the desert light, looking at the horizon with an expression that was not performing anything at all. Frank Lisciandro, who had been there for it, the shooting days in the Mojave, the small screening, the long years of the film's quiet existence, would say in later interviews that making HWI had been the most important collaboration of his professional life. Not because the film was perfect, not because it had found a large audience, but because it had captured something that no concert footage and no studio photograph and no magazine cover had ever managed to capture. Jim Morrison without the apparatus. Jim Morrison in a landscape in the light being only what he actually was. That in the end was what HWI was about, not the highway, not the hitchhiker, not the American mythology of the open road, though all of those things were present in it. It was about a person trying, in the only way left available to him, to be seen as something other than what the world had decided to see. It was 50 minutes of a 25-year-old man standing in the desert and asking, quietly and without expectation of an answer, whether it was still possible to simply exist, to be a figure in a landscape, subject to the same light as everything else, carrying nothing except what was actually his. The answer for those 50 minutes was yes. What is rarely discussed about HWI is the specific decision Jim Morrison made regarding sound. A film needs music, this is the conventional wisdom, and it is conventional wisdom for reasons that are not entirely wrong. Music tells an audience how to feel about what they are seeing. It fills silence in ways that make silence manageable. It guides emotional response. For a filmmaker who was, by any measure, one of the most musically gifted people of his generation, the temptation to score his own film must have been considerable. He could have done it easily. The Doors were at the peak of their powers in 1969, A HWI soundtrack featuring new Morrison compositions would have been, commercially speaking, a significant event. He chose silence instead. Or not silence exactly, the film uses ambient sound, the actual audio of the locations where it was shot, the wind across the desert floor and the distant sound of trucks on the highway and the particular quality of open-air stillness that exists in the Mojave at certain hours. But no composed score, no songs, no Jim Morrison's voice delivering the kind of language that had made him famous. Just the image and the landscape and the figure moving through it, and whatever the viewer brought to the space between those things. This was a more radical decision than it might initially appear. Jim Morrison was, in 1969, inescapably associated with a particular kind of sound, the organ-driven, lyrically dense, psychologically intense music of the Doors, and with his own voice, which had become one of the most recognizable instruments in American rock. To make a film and deliberately withhold that voice, to insist that the images carry the weight without the support of the one thing that had made him famous, was to ask the audience to receive him on entirely different terms. Terms that the audience had not been offered before, terms that many of them were not equipped to accept. Paul Ferrara, who served as director of photography on HWI, recalled that Jim was specific and consistent about this from the earliest conversations about the project. He did not want a music film. He did not want the Doors in the background. He did not want the film to be, in any way, a vehicle for the persona that the music had built. He wanted the images to do what images could do when they were not being assisted or directed or explained by anything else. He wanted to find out what remained of his artistic instincts when the thing he was most famous for was removed from the equation. The film was, in this sense, not just a creative project but a kind of experiment, an attempt to answer the question of whether Jim Morrison the filmmaker could exist independently of Jim Morrison the rock star, and whether the answer to that question would reveal anything true about who he actually was.